Formally welcome you this evening. May I introduce the Right Honourable, the Lord Provost of the City of Glasgow, Councillor Sadie Docherty.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome the Scottish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament to the Glasgow City Chambers tonight. We gather today to mark the 70th anniversary of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by atomic bombs. As well as our events, there are a number being held across the country, from Aberdeen to Anstruther and from Paisley to Peebles. And of course, Glasgow has a proud anti-nuclear campaigning history stretching back more than 2 decades. This commitment has never waned, for we continue to provide the administration and secretarial support to the Scottish activities of nuclear-free authorities. The Glasgow councillors continue to represent the council in this movement, and Councillor Butler is here tonight with us. And of course, the Scottish CND has routinely forced governments and the nuclear industry to reconsider policies such as the transportation of low-level radioactive waste from Dounreay to Caithness and to Drigg in Cumbria. Our commitment to nuclear-free local authorities agenda continues with our membership of Mayors for Peace, founded by the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with the ultimate goal for achieving a nuclear-free world. The more recent tragedy at the nuclear one, I can't say it just now. Fukushima. No, it is. Fukushima. Okay. The more recent tragedy of Fukushima in Japan can only strengthen our resolve to opposing nuclear technology, and that's within all of our lifetimes. I think for me that is a very telling thing. Ladies and gentlemen, the gap between that incident and the one 75 years ago is only 66 years, and hundreds of kilometres separate those disasters, but they were absolute disasters. Our thoughts are with the innocent people of Hiroshima. I can't say that. Fukushima today, living with the fallout of that disaster. Apologies for not being able to say that, but I think it's something that Glasgow has got a very proud history of, and that is that we continue to campaign against nuclear arms.
Ladies and gentlemen, to reply to the Lord Provost Civic Welcome, may I introduce Alan McKinnon, Glasgow CND.
Try not to fall down and topple over. Okay, that always happens. Thank you very much. It was a very warm welcome from Glasgow Lord Provost, and it I think indicates the continuing active role that Glasgow is playing in the nuclear-free local authorities campaign, which we heard something about, and also the Mayors for Peace campaign, which is a growing campaign across the world. We're here today, of course, to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the dropping of the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. A single bomb destroyed 13 square kilometres of the city. 3 days later, another bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. The death toll from these two bombs has been estimated at around 260,000 people. These were not military targets. Less than 5% of the dead were military personnel. 95% were civilians. So as we commemorate these events 7 decades later, we should remember that there's a dangerous complacency about these weapons today. We've kind of normalised them. We've accepted that somehow this is normal to be living with nuclear weapons, when in fact it's not. And they are immensely dangerous, just as dangerous, if not more so, than they were with the first nuclear weapon. 18,000 of these weapons remain in the hands of the nuclear weapon states, mostly in the hands of the United States and Russia, each one of them with much more destructive power than the weapon that was used in Hiroshima. Many of them, at least 2,000, on hair trigger alert, ready to be launched on warning. And the number of times when we've been so close to nuclear accident, a nuclear war by accident, is breathtaking, in fact, and should be a warning to anyone who thinks that somehow it's possible to live long term with these weapons. They are, for a number of reasons, immoral, illegal, and a colossal waste of money. And we've got 200 warheads just 25 miles down the coast in Coalport and Fastlane. So we've got them on our doorstep. So as well as being a colossal waste of money, they send all the wrong messages around the world. If nuclear weapons are necessary for our security, which is the argument our government continuously makes, then why not for the security of every other country in the world? That argument should be able to apply in equally. Of course, that's a nonsense. If you had 200 countries in the world with nuclear weapons instead of just 9 as we have at the present time. The truth is that these weapons provide absolutely no security, not to anyone in Scotland or any other part of Britain. Instead, it puts us in danger. And if we threaten others around the world, then we should not be surprised if we become targets ourselves. All the more reason then for us to get rid of these weapons and join the global campaign for a worldwide ban. That campaign is now supported by the governments of 113 countries at least. It's growing almost daily across the world. So it's a national campaign for us. It's a campaign in Scotland, it's a campaign in Britain, but it's also a campaign that's international as well. Two important components of that campaign. So I'm delighted that we've got the support of Glasgow City Council for the event tonight, and we've been able to hold the meeting in this delightful place, and I'm delightful with the welcome from the Lord Provost. And I know that the people in this room represent a very broad range of opinion in Scotland. Civic Scotland, in fact, is what we represent, and we should never forget that we're speaking for hundreds of thousands, millions of people in Scotland who share the same views as us. So what we're going to hear tonight, the testimonies, the poems, the music, the historical context in which these weapons were used, the medical effects of these weapons, all of that should remind us again that the disaster of nuclear war should never be repeated. And just the reality of what these weapons represent. And if our message is to be that these weapons must never be used again, then the only way to make sure that happens is for us to get rid of them. Not only in Scotland, but from every other part of the UK and every other country in the world. So we need to build the anti-Trident campaign, but we need to also build the international campaign to achieve a global ban, which is growing so fast at the present time. So without further ado, can I ask Chris Dolan to come and do some readings. Thanks.
Hi, I thought I'd start with just a wee anti-war poem by a local writer, by Jackie Kay. And it's quite interesting because it's Jackie writing about her dad, John Kay, who I know a number of people in this room will know. So this is called Bantam by Jackie Kay. And it's headlined, "My father at 87 remembers his father at 17. It wasn't men they sent to war. It was boys, like bantams. We men named after a small breed of chickens, or later, a jeep, a bike, a camera. That needy for soldiers, they dropped height restriction, so small men came to war. As a prisoner, my father's weight fell, and years later, the shrapnel for the Somme shot out a wee jewel hidden in his left arm." That's Jackie Kay's poem. I've done a number of these things, but I'm always very, very privileged to be asked to do little things like this. I'm always looking for war poems, and every time I do one, I think I should really ring something specially, and it's usually too late, and that's the case this time again. But the last book I had out kind of touches on the whole subject of war and belief and stuff like that. So I thought I'd just read a couple of very small bits from Aliyah, which is Sumnaro. I should just tell you the background to it is very, very loosely based on a Robert Louis Stevenson short story called Olala. And it's about a young soldier, I call him here Captain Haldane, who's stuck behind enemy lines, and he's in a house, as far as he knows at the moment, with an older man who's a kind of a cleric figure called Duban, and a woman called Mahaba. And that's about all he knows. He can't remember what brought him there. There's something to do with the helicopter, that's all he knows. So this is just a little bit of a conversation between Haldane and Duban, the older man. Tell me about the war. All wars are the same, Thomas. Duban sat in a low stool under the canopy of an ancient tree, like a man in a pew under a vaulted church roof. Haldane leaned against the tree trunk. One war leads to another, and then another. War breeds war. But what about this particular war, Duban? No doubt distinguished by its unique weapons, the design of uniforms, its medals, flags. There are particular massacres, atrocities. It came out of the last war, and it will lead to the next. Haldane smiled at the old man. You think a lot, Duban. I didn't say tell me about war, but about the war, this war. I'm only trying to remember. Then I'm of no use to you, my friend. They're all the same to me. Haldane sat in the grass and kept his back against a tree. Is war always evil? Doesn't it show nobility, courage, fighting for the good? Perhaps it can, perhaps, but which good? And to what end, I wonder? Haldane thought for a moment and asked, if each war stems from the last, then there must have been a first war, the daddy of them all. Duban says, I think that is possible. A battle so long ago and in so distant a place that we cannot now comprehend who or what started it or what it was about. All we know is it was never finally won or lost, as no war ever is. Recon. The word came back to him later as he lay in his bed, the room infused with ambergris or some aroma that reminded him of incense in chapels. His job had been reconnaissance. He hadn't thought they were overly deep into enemy territory that day in the helicopter. They were laughing about something. He had an image in his head of seeing a woman lying in a clearing, happy, sunning herself. But then in the helicopter there was a noise, not an explosion, more like when a car prangs, nothing too alarming. Something may have gone wrong with the engine. There was no one below that he could remember who could have hit them with bullets or shells, but the engine noise kept changing, the pilot anxiously pushing buttons and pulling levers. At first, the chopper seemed to float upwards. Then it swooped, swirling them about inside, throwing them around in their seats. There was shouting, a rush of wind, and a door opened somewhere. And then the plunging. Not just falling, but being sucked down and into darkness, though it must still have been daytime. Not dropping, but being pulled, as if some force below, some beast below even the ground itself, was reaching up and grabbing them, tearing them out of the sky. Haldane's skin froze as he remembered the terror of that lurching, the headlong dive, the suction from under the earth. He was shivering on his bed now, violently, and he thought that if he should have died then, he was going to now instead. Then there was darkness, like oil, crude and rancid, until he was no longer there, not in his bed or in infinite blackness, just a knowledge that there was nothing, that in that nothing there was the idea of him. Just before he woke, or as he was waking, the darkness seemed to change, soft, velvety, then the smell of pear, pomegranate, and he opened his eyes to white walls and the window with a single green tree and its crimson blooms. He remembered Mahaba, working at her embroidery the night before. Curses and blessings, she said. I'm never quite sure that we little mortals are worth such great things. Like heaven and hell, they seem out of proportion to me. Our puny exploits on earth hardly deserve so much, don't you think, Captain? But I do believe in dreams. I like to make things, Captain Haldane, like this gown. Each time I start on a new piece, I want it to be what I see in my mind's eye in my dreams. Of course, that never happens. It's not just never as good as I hoped, but it also turns out different. Something other than what I'd set out to make. There's a kind of destruction in everything we tried to create, but that shouldn't keep us from the attempt. Haldane had said, "I'm sorry, I'm not quite following." "It doesn't matter," Mahaba laughed. "I'm only saying we need to do something with our dreams. Otherwise, they may stop visiting us, and that would be darkness." So that's from one last little poem. This is from, if you come across me, he's fantastic, Sankichi Toge, whose whole life is extraordinary. He died quite young, but he was a survivor of the bombing of Hiroshima. And he's written a whole number of lovely poems. This is a very short one. I got an even shorter one at the very end. And this is called, by Sankichi Toge, it's called No More Hiroshimas. Give back the human. Give back my father. Give back my mother. Give grandpa back. Grandma back. Give me my sons and daughters back. Give me back myself. Give me back the human race. As long as this life lasts, this life, give back peace. That will never end. So that's Sankichi Toge. And one tiny little thing, I was looking for a little haiku, but piece to finish up with. And I thought, well, I couldn't find anything that was exactly right, so I thought I should try and write something. It's only 17 syllables. So I'm going to write, so I've written a haiku. But I remember when I was writing, I remember the haiku by John Cooper Clarke, whose haiku I love is, "To write a poem in exactly 17 syllables is very, very difficult." But this actually has 17 syllables. Prayers rise up like poison gas, heavens in a rage. Let there be peace on earth.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very appropriate contributions. Can we now have a song from Eddie Maguire? Sorry, a tune from Eddie Maguire. Eddie, of course, is a well-known composer and musician and performer who is well known to many of the senior members of his audience.
To help us contemplate Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I thought I would play a traditional Japanese tune, Yashi Nomi. It means the coconut song, and it's one that would have been known by the children at that time in the 1940s. And it featured in the 1980s film called The Burmese Harp, a Japanese film about the end of the Second World War. So this is Yashi Nomi.
much, Eddie. That was lovely. It really was. Can I now ask John Ainsley, who's the administrator of Scottish CND, to come and put the attacks on the city of Hiroshima into a historical context?
In August 1945, there was troops from Britain and America that were in the troop ships sailing off towards the Far East, and they were preparing to take part in what they thought was going to be a very bloody invasion of the Japanese islands. And when the war ended very suddenly, after the atomic bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then these troops felt that their lives had been saved by the bomb. Their views were genuine, but the question is whether these troop soldiers were correct in their analysis of why the war actually ended. The newspaper headlines at the time were proclaiming that there was this new super weapon and that had forced Japan to surrender. And this version of history very quickly took hold because it was very convenient for our point of view of the United States. It provided a way of sidestepping the whole moral issue of what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the dreadful destruction, which as the years went by, that became a major issue. But said, well, actually, it was justified because of the saving the cost of the invasion. These may have been barbarous weapons, but the media were then saying the attack was justified because by killing thousands in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they saved the lives of a higher number of troops that would have been casualties in an invasion. The other reason it was convenient for the United States was because it had this huge, massive project, biggest ever industrial project, the Manhattan Project to build the bomb, which had cost them $2 billion, which is a huge amount in those days. So the question of, they've done all this and some justification for it. But this theory is not only convenient for the Americans, it was also convenient for senior people in Japan because there was this big problem that suddenly surrendered. And well, the reason they surrendered was because there was this new scientific invention. But an analysis of the circumstances surrounding the surrender gives serious grounds for disputing the traditional narrative. If we think of the latter years of the Second World War, we might think that on the one hand you've got Germany and Japan, on the other hand you've got Britain, America and Russia. But that actually is not true. Russia stayed out of the Pacific War. They had a non-aggression pact with Japan. In February 1945, Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt met at Yalta in the Crimea. At that meeting, Stalin agreed that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany had surrendered. And that then meant that would have been the 8th of August 1945. This deal was kept a secret from the wider world, very much a secret. And it's very significant from the Japanese perspective. The Japanese leadership in the closing months of the war placed a lot of faith in the hope that somehow or other, they had diplomatic relations with Moscow, that somehow or other Stalin was going to mediate a way out of their position. They knew they were going to lose, but somehow or other the Soviet Union would broker some deal with the United States that would mean their capitulation was done in a way that they gained as much as possible. And then out of the blue, at 11 o'clock at night on the 8th of August, the Soviet ambassador informed the Japanese government that they were now at war. And that was a breach of the Japan-Soviet non-aggression pact. Japanese intelligence had failed to properly detect the scale of the Soviet build-up in the East. The Soviet Union had basically moved a lot of its battle-hardened troops from the West into around the Manchuria area. And they were totally ill-prepared for the devastation attack that they faced. By the time the surrender was formally signed, which was the 2nd of September, 1.5 million Soviet troops had completely routed the Japanese army in Manchuria, and had captured the islands of Sakhalin and Kuril. Japan had a huge army, but their army was focused on the southern islands in Japan, preparing for an American invasion. They weren't seriously expecting that Russia would attack. Earlier in the summer of 1945, Togo, the Japanese foreign minister, had been instructed to try to extend the non-aggression deal. It already had a year to run, but they were negotiating with Moscow to extend that even further beyond 46. He was also told, they weren't all that hopeful, but he was told to try to negotiate an alliance with Russia. They were trying to get the Soviet Union on their side, and they thought that was a serious possibility. Where the reality was that months earlier, Stalin had done this deal at Yalta that he was going to enter the war and invade them. So that the Soviet involvement totally came out of the blue from the Japanese point of view. And although they expected an American invasion, the American invasion they thought was months off. It's not going to happen tomorrow, it's going to take a long time. Well, the reality was they were faced with a very immediate military threat from the other side. It's not correct to say that Hiroshima was the only factor in Japan's surrender. There are two issues at play. One is the destructive US attacks, including the nuclear bombs, but the other one is Soviet intervention in the Pacific War. And it can be argued that that second factor was in fact more important. Japan had already suffered massive damage from the firebombings. They were basically using napalm to destroy urban areas. So there had already been a change. They were bombing with conventional bombs, and then they made this change to firebombing, and then they made a step up again in terms of the nuclear weapons. 68 cities had been attacked and either destroyed or partially destroyed. 26 of those attacks took place in the 3 weeks before the atomic bombs. So if you were, the Japanese leadership were sitting, getting these reports pretty well every day, saying this city's been 50% destroyed, this one's been 70% destroyed. That's the actual climate in which they then had this other thing of saying, well, Hiroshima's been destroyed and Nagasaki's been destroyed. The first atom bomb was dropped 8 o'clock on the 6th of August, and there are no indications that that immediately brought about a sea change in thinking. They didn't immediately after that think, right, now everything's changed. The notice of Russia's intervention was delivered at, say, 11 o'clock at night on the 8th, and it was immediately after that, on the morning of the 9th of August, that the Supreme Council of Japan met to consider details of how they would surrender. And that meeting started before the news came through of the second attack on Nagasaki. They were already thinking about surrender, and the Hiroshima attack had happened, but the Nagasaki one hadn't. I think all that this suggests that the key factor that changed was actually Stalin's military intervention. But Russia's significant in a second way, and this is an American academic in the 1960s so looked at this. Basically, the Manhattan Project was started to build a bomb because they thought Germany was going to build a bomb. By the end of 1944, it was clear that wasn't the case. The German program hadn't got anywhere. At this point, Joseph Rotblat, who's one of the senior scientists and who went on to play a leading role in the disarmament movement, Rotblat left the Manhattan Project at the end of 44 when it was clear its original purpose of dealing with Germany, that was no longer valid, but the project kept rumbling on. Earlier in March 1944, Rotblat was at a dinner with General Leslie Groves, who headed the Manhattan Project. And what he heard Groves say was this, that from 2 weeks after taking up the post, there was never any illusion on my part that the main purpose of the project was to subdue the Russians. The person who led the project knew from the beginning that the main purpose of it was to deal with this threat in Russia that was seen in terms of future Cold War. And in the closing years of the Second World War, that was very much the background to it, that Russia is going to be the future threat. Truman, before the first test in July 45, says, if it explodes, and I think it will, I will certainly have a hammer on these boys, meant the Russians. The Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, the bomb has to be delivered on time, so there's no necessity for concessions to the Russians. They didn't want to get involved in trying to do deals. Russia gets part of Japan, America gets part of Japan. The Secretary of War, Henry Simpson, said on the 19th of July they should use the bomb to gain political advantage over the Soviet Union in a post-war situation. And very soon after the bombs were dropped, America was drawing up plans for dropping nuclear bombs on 20 cities in the Soviet Union. Another thing that's been raised is the whole question of the role of the Emperor. On the 13th of May, the Foreign Ministry had sent a message to Moscow trying to mediate, basically saying the Emperor is desirous of peace. American intelligence was intercepting all the messages, so the American intelligence knew in May that this message was coming from the Emperor, saying that he was looking for a way out. And the Secretary of State in America at the time said that his view was that they could get Japan to surrender so long as the Emperor's position was maintained. That was the key thing to surrender, was that the Emperor stays. However, the declaration that was then made on the 26th of July, here's the conditions of surrender, made no mention of that. And it has been argued that that was particularly excluded to draw things out. Another factor is, to some extent, it was called an experiment. Both Truman and Groves talked about this experiment, and they had two designs. You've got a highly rich uranium design, the Fat Man dropped in Hiroshima. You've got a plutonium design in Little Boy that was dropped in Nagasaki, and it was an experiment to test these two designs. Brian Quayle's been very helpful with this. Just a couple of the quotes that he's dug out. General Chennault, who was the commander of the US Air Force in China and therefore had a particular insight into what was going on, he basically said the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan was decisive in hastening the end of the war in the Pacific, which would have occurred even if the atomic bombs were not used. The swift blow struck at Japan by the Red Army completed the encirclement, which forced Japan to surrender. There's a whole series of military folk who've said similar things. One of them was Field Marshal Montgomery. In my view, it was unnecessary to drop the two atomic bombs, and I cannot think it was right to do so. The dropping of the bombs was a major political blunder and a prime example of the declining standards in the conduct of modern warfare. Just at that point, and just a slight sort of final aside to this, the nuclear bombings took place in a climate where the US Air Force were mounting daily firebomb attacks, destroying Japanese cities, similar to Dresden and what happened there. After the war, the Red Cross tried to address some of these issues of the way that war was conducted, and that resulted in a number of protocols in Geneva Convention. Protocol 3, adopted in 1981, specifically deals with these incendiary attacks. It prohibits firebombing of civilians, but not only that, it prohibits firebombing of military targets located within a concentration of civilians. So basically, the attacks that took place on Dresden, on Tokyo, and on the other Japanese cities would be specifically outlawed today, and a clear breach of international law. So in recent years, we've seen chemical weapons banned, biological weapons, landmines, cluster bombs prohibited. And although there's a sense that nuclear weapons are illegal, ICGA said generally contrary to the rules of principle of international law, there isn't a specific ban on them. But fortunately, there is a new initiative that's moving towards that. 113 countries within the last few months have supported a pledge from Austria, which basically says to fill the legal gap for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. So I think after 70 years, in this climate of what is now happening internationally, it's finally time that we ban the nuclear bomb.
Thanks very much, John. That was a masterly presentation of, which I think rebuts many of the arguments that have been made over the years, which attempt to justify the use of nuclear weapons. and particularly the first use of nuclear weapons in 1945. I'm going to say something now about the medical effects of nuclear war. The city of Hiroshima stands on a flat plateau on the Japanese island of Honshu. At 8:15 AM on the morning of the 6th of August 1945, a free-fall bomb was dropped from a B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay. It exploded 500 metres above the centre of the city in a busy residential and business area which was crowded with people going about their daily business. This was a new type of bomb with enormous destructive power. Its yield of around 12,000 tonnes of TNT was several thousand times more powerful than any previous conventional bomb. And the difference didn't just lie in the destructive power from a single bomb. It was different because it was a weapon of indiscriminate mass slaughter, unable to distinguish between soldiers and civilians, a weapon that would wipe out everything in its path, overwhelmingly civilians in this case. It was the ultimate in anti-personnel and anti-human weapons. We've already established that the terrain of Hiroshima was that of a flat plateau, so that after the bomb was exploded, unimpeded by hills or other natural features that could limit the blast, the fireball that was created by that single bomb went on to destroy 13 square kilometres of the city. Half of the energy generated by atomic weapons is given off as blast. The rest, 35%, is heat, and ionizing radiation, 15%. In Hiroshima, the epicenter of the explosion reached a temperature of several million degrees centigrade, creating a heat flash over a wide area, vaporizing all human tissue. And so within a radius of half a mile of the city, of the center of the blast, every person was killed. All that was left of people who were caught out in the open was their shadows burnt into stone. So this, beyond this central area, people were killed by heat and blast waves, either out in the open or inside buildings that were collapsing and bursting into flames. In the area immediately, in this area, the immediate death rate was 90%. The firestorm created hurricane-force winds which spread and intensified the fire. 63% of the buildings of Hiroshima were completely destroyed, and a further 30% were badly damaged. The total number of deaths, it's difficult to be certain, but there's been a number of estimates and revisions of that over the years. The best estimates today, I think, are that in Hiroshima, 75,000 people died in the first few hours. 140,000 had died by the end of the year, and by the end of that decade, by 1950, 200,000 was the death toll. Many of those who survived the immediate blast died shortly afterwards from fatal burns. Many of those not killed initially would have suffered horrific injuries from blast, collapsing buildings, flying debris, burns, all manner of things. The injuries included lacerations, abrasions, crush injuries, fractures, first, second and third degree burns. Tens of thousands of people therefore were badly injured and needing immediate medical care. But of course there was no medical care because the medical services had been destroyed along with everything else. So the nurses and the doctors, many of them had died along with it, and the whole infrastructure, medical infrastructure, had been destroyed at the same time. So effectively, very little help was available. In the biggest Red Cross hospital in the city, only 6 doctors out of 30 were able to function, and only 10 nurses out of 200. So very soon, these people, these care work and these care attendants were overwhelmed by the demand. Patients who slowly filled the hospital, occupying every bed, and ultimately occupying every inch of floor space. So in other words, what you're looking at here is the complete breakdown of rescue and medical services. Within 2 to 3 days, radiation victims began to appear. People who were near the epicenter developed symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, blood-stained diarrhea and hair loss. Most of these people died the same week. The radiation victims who were further away from the centre developed symptoms 1 to 4 weeks after the explosion. And those hit particularly severely were the fetuses of pregnant women. Many of them were born stillborn. They had a very high infant mortality rate at that time after the explosion. a lot of children were born with abnormally small skulls, a condition called microcephaly, and along with that went mental disabilities. You began to see an increase in the rates of leukemia about 2 years after the attack, and that peaked 4 to 6 years later, again affecting mainly children. Higher rates of solid tumours, cancer, began to arise around 10 years after exposure and became common after 1960. The main cancers that were generated by this were thyroid cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, and salivary gland cancer. And there was a direct correlation between the distance from the atomic bomb and the risk and rate of cancer. These first atomic bombs, the first generation were called atomic bombs. They were fission bombs, where the aim was to trigger and sustain a fission chain reaction, which produced very high levels of energy in a very, very short time. And the fissile material that they used, as John has already said, was uranium-235 in the case of Hiroshima and plutonium-239 in the case of Nagasaki. Very interesting why they used different bombs, different types of bombs in different scenarios. It was about part of a large experiment. That's really what it was about. Which I think helps to echo the points that John was making. The other important impact of these early bombs, which is true to all nuclear weapons, is something called the electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, which is a short burst of intense electromagnetic energy which damages all electronic equipment and disrupts its functions. And obviously that's for the attacking nation. One of the key things is to be able to knock out the ability of the attacked nation to be able to respond in terms of communication and to be able to organise some sort of resistance or some sort of response. So this would damage not only military and civilian communication systems, but it would damage almost all medical equipment as well in the modern day. Modern nuclear weapons, of course, are much more powerful than these early atom bombs. They're called H-bombs or thermonuclear weapons, and they use fission and fusion. The fission stage, which is the stage used by the early weapons, is used to create huge amounts of energy to trigger the fusion stage. And that is used because you can produce far bigger bombs in a more controlled way. So the warheads on Trident missiles, for example, are 8 times as powerful as those in the bomb used in Hiroshima. So if you want to know what would happen if these weapons were used today, you should read the pamphlet, Scottish CND pamphlet, If Britain Fired Trident, written by our own John Ainsley in 2013. Unfortunately, we don't have any copies of it. You can see it online, you can certainly read it online, but that's something that we're going to have to reprint, I think. And it's an estimate of what would happen if a single Trident submarine launched a boatload of warheads at Moscow. And this was the strategic scenario which was adopted certainly in the 1980s. Second biggest city in Europe, city of 11.5 million, and the estimate was that if 40 warheads from a single Trident submarine were launched in Moscow, the death rate would be 5.4 million people would die within a few days of the blast, as a result of blast, burns and radiation. Fatality rates would be 95% for those within 1.6 kilometres of each explosion, and very high levels of radioactive fallout, because they would be using ground burst explosions to try and disrupt communications and underground bunkers. All of that would be an important part of the process, and that in itself would produce huge additional amounts of radioactivity, which would present as fallout within a few days. So in other words, the horrors that we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be pretty small fry in comparison to the horrors that we might see in a nuclear war scenario today, that would face, for example, the people of Moscow if they were attacked. And as in 1945, the Red Cross have argued that the casualties would completely overwhelm the ability of medical services to react. As in Hiroshima, very little help would be available, medical staff would be quickly overcome, and they would have to make decisions about who to treat and who not to treat. Difficult decisions at the best of times, but under these circumstances, unbearable almost. So I do realise that this subject is a depressing subject, and we do as a campaign try to avoid too much shock horror stuff, because it can sometimes alienate people, but I think it's important on an occasion like this to remind ourselves of exactly what these weapons do, what they're there for, what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and what could happen if they were ever used today. And I think it emphasises that using these weapons is a crime against humanity, but if it's a crime against humanity to use them, it's also a crime against humanity to possess them with a view to using them. And that's, I think, was the main message I think we have to take home from today. So that's quite enough for me, I think. I'm now going to ask Arthur Johnson to come and give us a song.
I'm not sure if I'll need this microphone, but I'll stand here anyway. And when I see things like this, I always like to say, I'm glad there's so many of you still here. I was 4-year-old when this happened. I was brought up as a kid, everything. But I never get involved with CND. I was about 18, 19. And at that time, most of the big demos were beginning to die down. But I'd say to you, I want me one or two songs.
Can we take 2 songs?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice.
As you know, my songs, they're all about 8 minutes long anyway. Last night I had the strangest dream I've never dreamed before. I dreamt the world had all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamt I saw a mighty room, and the room was full of men, and the papers they were signing said we'd never fight again. And when the papers were all signed and 1,000,000 copies made, we all joined hands and bowed our heads, and grateful prayers were said. Then the people in the streets below were dancing round and round, and the rifle swords and uniforms were scattered on the ground. Sing away, mate. Last night I had the strangest dream I'd never dreamed before. I dreamt the world had all agreed to put an end to war. I'm sure there's enough people from the audience that will know this one. This is, well, to me it was always the anthem for all the CND marches. Can't you hear each bomb thunder, echoes like the crack of doom, while it tears our skies asunder, fall and makes this world a tomb. Do you want your hopes to tumble, rise in smoke towards the sky? Would you see yesterday's crumble? Would you let your children die? Men and women, stand together. Do not heed these men of war. Make your minds up now or never. Ban the bomb forevermore. Tell the leaders of the nation Let the whole wide world take heed. Poison from the radiation strikes at every race and creed. Would you put mankind in danger, murder folk in distant lands? Would you bring death to a stranger, have his blood upon your hands? As a protest song. Men and women, stand together, do not heed these men of war. Make your minds up now or never, ban the bomb forevermore. Tell the lead, I sang that, didn't I? Shall we lay this world in ruin? Only you can make the choice. Stop and think of what you're doing. Join the march and raise your voice. Last time. Men and women, stand together. Do not heed these men of war. Make your mind up now or never. Ban the bomb forevermore.
Thanks very much, Arthur. So rousing renditions as he always does. Can I just ask Mary Millington to come up and make a short announcement?
Today I went into Tollcross Park near where I live, and there's a lovely gardener there who let me pick some rose petals. I've got a great big bag of pink rose petals from Tollcross Park. I very much like company. I'm going to walk down to the Clyde and strew the petals in the Clyde in memory of those victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If anyone would like to come with me, meet me in about 5 minutes just inside the door downstairs, the front door.
Very good. Thanks very much. It just remains for me to thank everyone who contributed to us tonight for what's been a very successful event, I think. Thanks particularly to Glasgow City Council for hosting the event, for the Lord Provost, Sadie Docherty, for her very welcoming welcome, to Chris for his poems, his contributions, to Eddie for his wonderful music, and to John Ainsley for his rendition of the historical context, not exactly a rendition, but and to Arthur, of course, for bringing the event to a conclusion. So thank you very much to all of you for coming along, because that's